All right, so we're going to review all these objectives that we have covered in the previous lectures. So let me get a new document here. All right, so our MR system has three magnetic fields. Let's start with our first, our static magnetic field. And that's denoted by what? E0. Okay. All right. So there's no biological harm that the static magnetic field can do to our patient, right? It's a very strong magnet, but ultimately there's really no biological effects. What's the field strength that we normally deal with our static magnetic field? Field strength. Tesla. Okay, so 1.5, 3 Tesla. And you can also, so remember, inside the magnet, it's measured in Tesla, but outside, it's measured in Gauss. Okay, and what was the conversion?
10,000 Gauss equals 1 Tesla.
Good. All right. So we also have this thing called the static, I'm sorry, not the static, within the static magnetic field, we have the spatial gradient magnetic field. And the biggest confusion sometimes for even MR techs that have been working for a long time, they confuse this one because it says gradient. And what gradient means is just how it changes the field strength based on location. They confuse that one with time-varying gradient magnetic field. Okay, so just remember, spatial gradient magnetic field falls under static magnetic field. This is really talking about the field strength at specific locations surrounding magnet. Okay? So this is usually measured in Tesla per meter or Gauss per centimeter. All right? So those fringe fields or those flux lines surrounding the magnet can be mapped out. Remember, we have a map that shows where the spatial gradient magnetic field is the strongest. And where is it typically the strongest?
As it enters the pool.
I'm going to just say mouth of bore. Okay? Or edge, or, just basically that as the patient goes right into the bore, where you're standing, kind of hitting all the little controls on the scanner, that's where it's the strongest, because that's where the flux lines converge, yeah. Where they really condense, get closer together. So just remember, we have a plot, and you should print that plot out so that you know you have some kind of graph to go off of when you have a specific device that has like a limit on spatial gradient magnetic field. I'm just going to put plot. Very important to print that out. All right. So we don't have any biological effects from our static magnetic field, but where does the harm come from? Where does the potential harm come from? What'd you say for? Not this field. That's the RF. That's B1. Because we're putting energy in the patient. The static magnetic field. Where's the potential harm coming from? Attraction and rotation. Translation, rotation, and lens. So remember, the three forces, that's where the potential harm comes from. So translational, which is where we have, I'm just going to abbreviate, ferromagnetic objects strongly attracted to isocenter. Okay. Where is this the strongest? Translational forces. At the middle or outside? As you're approaching the magnet. So outside. Strongest outside. Okay. And typically it's once again at the mouth of the bore where those spatial gradient magnetic field is the strongest. Okay. Rotational. That's where that ferromagnetic device torques, right? So we have the torque force. We have the example of our aneurysm clip. And where is that the strongest, this force? At isocenter. Because our flux lines are, what we can say, directional. Straight up and down. And then the last force is the least threatening. It's lens. And it's really just talking about how Faraday's law of induction creates a magnetic field that will oppose B sub 0. And this is an example would be our what? What type of devices usually exhibit?
Like an infusion pump.
Infusion pump. So it doesn't have any ferromagnetic metal in it, but it's electrical. Because an electric current flows through it, creates a magnetic field that opposes B sub 0. So an example would be an infusion pump. So it could be insulin, it could be any pain medication. But the main thing there to remember is it's got an electrical component to it. And that electrical component creates a magnetic field that will oppose B sub 0 through Faraday's law of induction. Okay? So that summarizes the static magnetic field. Let's move on. RF B1. Okay, so this is the one that heats our patient up, right? So we are applying an RF pulse to excite hydrogen nuclei. And ultimately, that excitement will cause them to flip into our transverse plane, which is where we collect our signal. So all good things. This is an oscillating magnetic field, so it's moving. So when we're exciting tissue, due to our law of conservation of energy, we're putting energy into the tissue. It's got to be dissipated somehow, or it just gets absorbed by the patient, right? So our concern, so let's put potential danger arises from two things. What are those two things?
Heating and burns.
Heating and burns. So overheating. And when we talk about overheating, how's that usually measured? Like they usually measure energy being deposited into the patient with certain parameters. What were those things? SAR. Okay, specific absorption rate. So make sure you know that for the test, what these acronyms are. But what's the one that's now more accurate and we use today? Not SAR, but good. B1 plus RMS, which is, remember, B1 is the RF pulse coming into the patient, and it's the root mean squared. And what it is just kind of that positive pulse of that RF over 10 seconds. And we actually have another one, SED, and that's the entire pulse sequence. I'm sorry, the entire scan for that patient. And remember, SAR is based off of individual pulse sequences. So you could say per pulse sequence for SAR, and then SED is per scan. So it's the entire scan. So that's overheating. But then we had burns. And remember, burns is the most common adverse event. So from that lecture by, I think it was Miss Sawyer, she kind of really hit on that, right? She was like, people don't really, they're not concerned with this in clinical, but it's the most common thing, so why are we not more concerned about it? Sometimes it really is some of those urban legends about certain scanners won't burn a patient. Yeah.
So when I was watching that video, I was thinking about patients that are more obese, and when their thighs touch each other, is that technically still a loop?
Yeah, that's the biological loop.
But you said that it's when they're touching very minimally.
Very
I thought about that too, because I was like, well,
okay.
if you don't have a thigh gap, then yeah. But if it's just barely touching, then all of those electrons are trying to go through that
Yes.
site.
So it's worse to have just your thumb touching versus your whole hand, because all those electrons are forced through a very small contact point. And a lot of electrons, once it creates friction, it burns. So just think of like almost like thermionic emission. You have a very small coil in X-ray. You got all those electrons getting pumped to it through the filament circuit. You get boiling off of those electrons because of thermionic emission, and it's just like they have nowhere to go. It's all that crowded with electrons on a thin filament wire. No, they just get boiled off. So burns, okay, most common. All right, we had 4 types. What were the 4 types?
Proximity burns.
Proximity. Okay, and that's really just dealing with tissue in the near field. Remember that? So tissue in the near field touching our transmit coil. And remember, the transmit coil, really good students choose MRI, really is, remember, with that nesting doll, there really is the RF magnetic field, and that's the closest to the patient. All right, what's another one we just talked about? Induced loop. Tissues creating a biological circuit. Sorry to talk, we don't need to go into that anymore. What else? Reflective. And this is where we just put some kind of material on the patient that could possibly reflect that RF back towards the patient. So the most common, we would never put like a blanket that has some kind of coil in it, but the medication patches. And talking about medication patches, are we able to remove medication patches? No. We're not allowed to discontinue medication. That's out of our scope of practice. And then the last one, it's really dealing with devices. What's that one called?
Resonant.
Resonant. Or antenna effect, I believe. And that's just devices. So think about size, shape. And when it comes to size, I said any device less than 2 centimeters is not a concern. But as you get larger, depending on if you're dealing with a 1.5 or a 3 Tesla, so go back to that slide and look in the notes, because what they talk about is the length of our wavelength of that RF pulse and how it matches up with a 1.5 and a 3 Tesla. And in those situations, at a certain length, like 13 centimeters versus 26 centimeters of that, the length of that device will be more likely to cause a burn. Shape, we know that if it's got pointed edges, that's where the electrons converge. That's more likely to burn. Location, I guess you could say, another one. If they're looped in any way. So devices and how, and then how it's oriented. In relation to B0 or B1. Okay, so that's why sometimes we have to do x-rays of these devices to get all this information. Good. All right, next, magnetic field. Time varying, oh, you got a question? Time varying magnetic field. Okay. So the purpose of this is to spatially encode the data. So we have an X, Y, and Z gradients that are constantly doing that. So we have all this information and signal coming off the patient, but how do we put it in the right voxel so that it looks like an MR image that we typically see? It's our spatial encoding time-varying gradient magnetic field. So these are constantly turning on and off. So that's where we get that really loud noise, which can be described as Lorentz. Force, I think it is. Lorentz, yeah. That's the loud noise. So when we talk about loud noise, what is the requirement that the FDA states? At what decibel do we need hearing protection?
99.
So required at 99 decibels. And that is in the form of headphones or earplugs. And you guys should just practice good standards and just do both.
So does, when you have the music in your headphones, does that also contribute to the decibels? So would you have to take that into account, or is it?
I don't know if they've done it that extensive. I don't think they count that. I think they almost count that because it's probably at a lower decibel rating than the 99.
Mm-hmm.
So if it is lower, maybe it averages into it, and they can only reduce it more, I think.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, you try and be loud enough so that the patient can enjoy it and hear it over the gradients. But the only time patients really hear it is in between sequences. But yeah, that's a good question. I would maybe do a little investigating and see if that's incorporated. Okay, so that's a concern. But then, all right, so then let's say potential dangers from this magnetic field arise from what? So we have a constantly changing magnetic field. I'm going to put this up here. That's what time varying means. Constantly changing. And the magnetic field's not in the range of Tesla. It's way less, but it's still changing magnetic field. So what are the dangers? Obviously loud noises. We hit that one already, but what are the other two?
Peripheral nerve stimulation.
Peripheral nerve stimulation. And then I know you guys, like what FDA says, until they feel it, that's the only time, that we limit it. And we know that certain sequences can cause peripheral nerve stimulation a little bit more than others. And what's the seeing stars? What's that called?
Magnetophosphines.
Magnetophosphines. I guess that's still there, right? Whatever. And that's where we have the optic nerve, which is a conducting tissue, and we have changing magnetic field creates a voltage in that tissue. Magnetophosphines. All right. And then peripheral nerve stimulation. Not a concern, but I know one of the videos hit on something that until it really starts to be a tissue, a full organ stimulation, and that can happen. Because if it stimulates, and we think about the heart and how, like, the SA node fires off, that's very electrical in how that whole thing happens. So if you cause any kind of malfunction of just that normal kind of, contraction and relaxation of the heart, it could definitely cause the heart to, go out of rhythm. So that's where it would be really of a concern, where it's not just peripheral, but really dealing with a major organ. All right? So good. And then obviously the devices as well. We didn't really hit on it as much, but the devices, depending on their length and their shape, if you have some kind of electrical component to a device and you have a changing magnetic field, you can induce a voltage in that. So that's why, like, stimulators, wherever they're ending up, and you guys watch the videos, those deep brain stimulators, right? And those neurostimulators, it's not really the length of the wire, it's where they kind of end. And you're inducing a voltage in those stimulating wires, and then wherever it ends, it's going to deposit all that heat and burn that part of the brain. So devices, and think of just kind of an electric component to those devices. So examples like our deep brain stimulators. Good. All right. So that covers up to cryogen safety. So let's talk about our cryogens. What kind of cryogens are we dealing with?
Liquid helium.
Liquid helium. Sometimes nitrogen. Or a combination. Very cold, right? What's in Kelvin? 4 degrees Kelvin, which is like negative 276 degrees. Is it Fahrenheit or Celsius? I can't remember.
Celsius.
Okay, so very cold. So then our potential dangers arise from helium not properly ventilated. I laugh every time I say properly because my daughter constantly, "You're not doing that properly, Daddy." She watches Bluey all the time, and she has this little Australian accent where she says, "Accurately accordingly, properly. You're not doing that properly, Daddy. Not properly ventilated. All right. So, what can happen when those helium gases build up? What are the concerns there? It's going to go really bad really quickly.
The patient inhaling?
Asphyxiation. Asphyxiation. So unable to breathe. I cannot spell asphyxiation. Okay. Frostbite. What else? Combustion, right? Combustion. All right.
Fire.
Yeah, that's the fire with it. What else?
Higher pressure.
Higher pressure, yeah. Increases, and that could possibly cause tympanic membrane rupture. All right. So if everything goes right with the quench, it just gets released out to the atmosphere. And what's the actual vent on the outside? What's that considered? Zone what? Zone 4? I think it's zone 3. On the slide there.
Yeah, it's zone 3.
Zone 3. So make sure you remember zone 3 at the exit of that bed. You don't want anybody to be around that or pointed towards the outdoor seating area, things like that. Okay, so that's cryogen safety. Zones, this is an easy one. You guys have gone over this many times. How many do we have?
4.
Zone 1, no restrictions. Zone 2. Oh. What's that considered? MR waiting area. Are they screened at this point? Unscreened. Zone 3. Screened.
By the proper person.
By level 2 personnel. Okay. Can a level 1 personnel bring a patient into zone 3? Can a level 1
No.
trained personnel, they cannot accompany, they can only keep themselves safe in zones 3 and 4. Okay. Just remember that, zone 3. And this is also the console area. All right, and then zone 4, that's our scanning room. Highest area for danger. All right, personnel. How many levels do we have?
3.
We have 3, but the first one's just called non. Yep. Non-MR. Patients. Family. Level 1. How much training they get? Limited. Minimal. His example is who?
Front desk people that are
Yep.
signing you in.
MR administration. And then level 2. Good. Extensive. And remember, both of these, they have to get annual training. main thing about level 1, remember, they can only keep themselves safe in zones 3 and 4, cannot accompany a patient. And they can help them, assist them into filling the screen. They can answer some questions, but ultimately, who screens them? Us. Medical device labeling. All right, we have 3. What are they?
Safe, conditional, and unsafe.
Okay. Safe and unsafe, those are at the very limit, so they're easiest to kind of rule out. Safe just being non-magnetic, non-electrical. Okay. Unsafe, ferromagnetic. Remember, these are all based off that what? What angle? Based off deflection angle. So remember, safe angle is 0. Conditional less than 45. Unsafe 45 or higher. Because the device being attracted versus gravity pulling it down. That's what deflection angle means. All right, and then conditional. The conditions are what? What are the conditions?
It is safe or it's not safe. It's like guidelines of the manufacturer.
Yep. So the conditions of the device. So the 3 magnetic fields. SAR limits. And now RP1 plus RMF, etc. Location of the device. All those things. This person's really screwing up my recording. All right. Patient prep, you guys go through all those slides. It's hard to go off that. And emergency response. So this is a great little review. I will save this and I'll send it out as well. I'll post it on Canvas. But it's not all you need to review. Because there's FDA limits for things. Make sure you guys print this out and study this. Because you have FDA limits on SAR. Know these ones right here. You have FDA limit for the static magnetic field. So for all patients, including 1 month of age and lower, you can scan them at 4 Tesla. 4 Tesla. Who has a 4 Tesla scanner? So it's basically everybody. But if you're scanning a patient under okay, so sorry. So if you are scanning how do I phrase this? My brain's not working today. Okay, so if you have a patient that is less than a month old, the limit is 4 Tesla. But for patients that are a month old or higher, you can scan them at 8 Tesla. So it's just an FDA limit. I don't know why they make you remember that, but they do for the registry. Here are limits in terms of time-varying magnetic field, but remember, for peripheral nerve stimulation, it's just until the patient feels it. Acoustic noise we talked about. And then remember your temperature and humidity for your room. And then here are your normal, first level, and second level. Remember, second level, that's restricted to research. You do not need to worry about that. But the main thing you need to know is it heats up our core body temperature by 0.5, 1, and greater than 1 degree Celsius, depending on the level. Okay. So make sure you remember these more so than your local transmit and receive. Okay. So we got a couple minutes. We can't play the whole game. You might be able to get through it. These are pretty quick. You guys, with that review, should do just fine. All right, so put your stuff away. I'll send that document out if you didn't get a chance to write all that. So let's play this. Just raise your hand. I'm not going to keep score, but let's just, if you don't get it right, we'll just move on to the next person. Let's go through this as a review. So, who wants to kick us off? Anybody played Jeopardy? You guys know how Jeopardy works. Just name a value and the category that you feel most confident in. They should get harder as you go up in value, but that didn't really work out for me for this. I just put a question. Who wants to kick us off? Margo, you want to kick us off?
Yeah.
What you got?
I'll do zones personnel.
300? All right. Remember, ACR recommends Zone 2 signage designates an area intended for blank MR patients. Not screen. Unscreened. So Zone 2 is still unscreened. The barrier between Zones 2 and 3, that's where the screening happens. Remember, they're filling out the screening form, going to the bathroom in Zone 2. Good. All right, Katie, go ahead and give us our next one.
I'll do 400.
400. According to the white paper's MR safety, how many persons identify into levels where level 2 personnel include
Extensively trained.
and give me an example.
MRI tech.
Good. All right, what you got? Still on you, Katie.
Let's go 200 then.
Console is typically located when's that?
4. 3. I'll go back 3.
3. All right. Fuad, why don't you pick this up?
Well, Alex,
R.I.P.
terminology for 100.
All right. SAR stands for?
Specific absorption rate.
Nice. What you got, Fuad?
Terminology for 3.
300. All right. Infected patient may experience seeing stars.
That would be
I spelled it wrong, probably.
needlephosphates.
Oh, I forgot. Oh, yeah. All right, what you got? Drew, why don't you pick a category?
Let's go FDA limits for 100.
All right. Temperature, humidity levels, what should they be? We just saw it.
65 through 75?
Yeah. Degrees Fahrenheit. What was the humidity level percentage-wise?
Oh gosh. No idea for that one.
50 to 70%. Make sure you guys know that. That's always a registry question. Drew, staying on you, what you got?
Emergency for 100.
All right. Rotational forces are due to?
Is it
Yeah, torque or rupture, twist, rotate. Angelique, why don't you pick a category? 300. Most important element needed to maintain MR safety is, we didn't really talk about this, but what do you think? How do we incorporate an environment of good MR safety amongst our staff? Education. If we educate them correctly, we get this initial first training on how to, then they can educate other techs, and it's just this good learning environment. Savannah, why don't you pick a category?
Terminology for 200.
All right, what's this one?
MR conditional.
Nice. It's no longer MR compatible. Just remember that. They sometimes bring that, loop that back in. Staying on you. What do you got?
Terminology for 400.
Good practice. All patients MRI should be wet and blunt. Squeeze ball. Visually. Good job, Drew. Drew, what you got?
I guess terminology for 400.
Okay. Terminology for device implants and modified fused radioscope. Where the term MR, I didn't know I had this as a question. Compatible has been replaced. Angelique, what did you pick another one?
3, 400.
All right. Minimal acceptable method for detection intraocular ferrous form biopsy. Good, we didn't talk about this. Remember the metal shading. What's the minimum modality that we can do to rule that out? X-ray. The next higher up would be CT. Margo, why don't you pick another one?
Emergency for 500.
Okay. During a quench, this could happen. What are those things that we talked about that can have build up in the room? Anybody can answer.
Like pressure,
Pressure,
fire,
combustion, yeah.
or
Frostbite. Ruptured contaminant. All right. So we'll just do Final Jeopardy because we're about
That music is very loud.
Oh man, it gives us those. But remember, if you see a big
Move it
signal
from the
boy, bring
same
them out.
lane.
Yeah, do not move their head. Just keep them going all the way out the magnet straight out to prevent crossing those flux lines. All right, awesome. But that document is on Canvas, and you can go click through all those if you desire.